Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Floral Endowment's Grow Pro webinar series. I'm your moderator, Sarah Hewlings. I'm a member of AFE's Young Professionals Council, and I have experience in horticulture and floriculture industry as a research and development specialist. I'm currently looking for new positions in this field and am open to any opportunities in North Carolina. Today's session is on nutrient management strategies for spring crops. On behalf of the endowment, I'm excited to be part of AFE's Grow Pro webinar series that features a new topic every month, presented by an industry expert. The webinars are free to everyone thanks to the generous support of AFE sponsors. The views and opinions expressed in these webinars are of those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of AFE. As an independent nonprofit, AFE cannot endorse any specific product or opinion. Today's webinar is sponsored by Ball Seed. Ball Seed is North America's leading wholesale horticultural distributor. It combines extensive experience, innovative thinking, and world-class customer service to ensure professional growers have the best products, most efficient tools, dynamic growing solutions, and more. If you'd like to learn more about our sponsors or are interested in becoming a sponsor for a topic, you can find that information on AFE's website, endowment.org/growpro. Today's session was pre-recorded in English by Dr. Brian Whipker. After the presentation, he will join us for a Q&A. Feel free to submit your questions to the Q&A feature or chat at any time. We'll answer as many as we can before the end of the hour. Unanswered questions may be answered through a separate email exchange. This session is being recorded and will be shared to AFE's YouTube account. Through YouTube's accessibility features, you can access closed captions in other languages. To get us started, I'd like to share a bit about today's expert speaker. Dr. Whipker's primary responsibilities are to conduct relevant research and extension activities on commercial floriculture crops in North Carolina. He has statewide extension responsibilities in commercial floriculture production with an emphasis on plant nutrition, plant growth regulators, and crop problem diagnostics. Dr. Whipker, welcome, and thank you for presenting today on nutrient management strategies for spring crops.
Welcome to this Nutrient Management Strategies for Spring webinar that we're doing. I'm Brian Whipker at NC State, so we're going to go over some of the strategies to consider for this upcoming spring season. So I'm not going to go over use this much nutrients for each one of these elements, but look at some of the key factors that I oftentimes get questions from growers about. So let's get started. So we're going to cover three different areas. And so basically the two ends, 1 and 3 is the bun, and the real principles that we're looking at, the meat of the presentation is going to be those items in the center. So I do want to go over a quick checklist. And so it's supposed to be more plant nutrition. So we're doing substrate pre-testing and injector check. But it's, if you're going to do that, let's talk about the furnace. Let's look at about weeds. And then principles, I want to talk about why a basic fertilizer can turn acidic on you and change the pH. Look at some of the main symptomology that we're dealing with a low pH problem and a high pH problem, and then look at the multiple characteristics that occur when there's a phosphorus deficiency. Those are items that I'm dealing with most years that growers have questions about. And then finally, a little information about a project that we're doing with AFE, looking at revising leaf tissue analysis standards, and then some of the diagnostic guides that we're working with. So let's get started on the checklist. So furnace inspection, I know that there was an eGrow alert that was published recently, but looking at the heat exchangers for cracks, leaks in the system, basically to avoid air pollution problems. You'll oftentimes see the problem at the coldest days of the year because you're running the furnace all the time. And if you really sealed the greenhouse up well, those gases can accumulate and you get lower leaf loss like that's occurring there. Some growers with cracked heat exchangers, maybe not quite as bad as these, have told me JB Weld works great, the heat one, and there is some furnace tape that can be used because basically you're keeping that gas going up in that heat exchanger versus going out into the greenhouse and causing problems. Weeds can also be a problem. Basically, they can harbor a lot of insect issues. We really try to get rid of the weeds in our poly houses, but we have a little flooding sometimes that goes on and brings the weed seeds in. Also, we suspect that the ants are bringing in the aphids because they like aphid farms for food. And so if you remove those weeds, it goes a long way of preventing spider mites, uh, Western flower thrips, and aphids and whiteflies in the greenhouse. So if you start clean, you can stay clean during the production cycle. Now, shifting more into nutritional aspects is how do you know what the status is of your substrate if you haven't pre-tested? So it's a great idea to take a pre-test. So get like a Ziploc bag, a quart size, put a representative sample in there, wet it up enough that you get the limestone to react. And so it's got to be, it's not soppy, but it is very well moist. And you need about 4 days for that limestone to react to get you a stable pH. And then 1 part soil, 2 parts water, that test really will enable you to pre-check the initial starting pH, just trying to make sure it's specs. A lot of the companies try to target 5.8 to 6.0, and then you can find out how your EC is. Now, the EC might not be much because it's only a pre-plant charge. But if you know what you're starting with, you can avoid any problems in case there wasn't enough lime added or there was too much of a charge in that mix. Finally, let's look at the injector. Let's make sure it works. So the simple test is get a clear sample A, get the end of the hose fertilizer solution B, and then calculate the rate that it should be targeted, that's C. That's usually on the bag for the rate you're mixing and the injector ratio that you're using. So does B minus A equal C? So the example is if the clear water is 0.1, and the fertilizer out of the hose is 1.49 and the calculated is 1.42, the math there at the bottom would come out that we roughly are getting delivered 1.39. You should be 1.42, so you're a little on the lean side, so you can mix a little more. You can do an adjustment on the ratio if you need to. But usually if the injector busts, it doesn't go up, it goes down. So it reminds me of a story of talking to a grower, and he was looking at the crop. It looked a little peaked, new grower. He said, how are things going? How's the fertilizer? And the guy goes, the fertilizer's great. I haven't had to mix any for 3 weeks. So obviously the injector was broken and he didn't know that he needed to make a change for what's going on. So by looking at the injector and doing the pre-test, you can determine what's going on. So now let's talk about some basic principles that are key to helping you grow a crop for the spring cycle. So the question that comes up, why does my basic fertilizer become acidic? It changes the pH to acidic conditions. And so when we're looking at nutritional problems, usually we're looking for nitrogen and it's the lower leaves that start developing symptomology. And that's because it's a mobile element. And so you can see the classic case here of lower leaf yellowing on that plant. It's complete yellowing that's developing, then leaf drop will occur on that plant. Over the years, we've done different rate studies. You can see that starting at 50 part per million on the left, increasing the rate, you kind of get a plateau and it goes back down. The standard growth curve that occurs when you're increasing fertility. And so you're trying to find the sweet spot of maximizing the growth like at 100 part per million. We've done some studies that go along with the AFE project that we're doing, but in this case, we ran 8 different variety or rates of nitrogen. It's listed as nitrogen, but really it's an EC study. Currently, with poinsettia as part of the grant, we're running 10 rates. But you can see if the rate's too low, like at 37 and a half, the growth is less. It improves at 75, kind of peaks at 112 and a half up to 225, and then starts going down. So the same rate response curve that's occurring with those plants. So the key is trying to maximize growth with the least amount of fertility. And that is the key point of where you could target to make sure that a basic fertilizer works as you want it to. So we've done a number of studies and we've gone through and plotted the information. So the key information here is the top is the substrate pH, the green line. Then you have the red line, which is the calculated fertilizer rate that you should deliver based on the bag. And then the EC of the substrate is what we measured in those pots. So as you increase the fertilizer rate from 0 up to 600 part per million, what occurs? The key is looking at the red line at the bottom. As it starts going up, where does it intersect with the substrate? And that occurs around 150 part per million. You see where that zone where it overlaps. If you then look up at the green line, that's also where the pH started going higher. So the basic fertilizer is working and doing what it needs to do. Where things go wrong is when the EC starts accumulating as the rate goes up. So you can see the blue line going up. That is excessive fertilizer being supplied. Basically, you're wasting your money because you're not getting any other growth of that plant. And then you're also then making the pH go down. The reason is that the basic uptake procedure that goes on in affecting the pH only has so much power. And all fertilizers, when mixed, are acidic, and there is more chemical effect of that acidity to overwhelm that reaction of uptake, and hence the pH goes down. And that is why a basic fertilizer can be acidic and lower the pH and then lead to problems with the crop. So it's something to keep in mind of trying to balance that EC of need with what you're supplying to get the pH where it needs to be. So make sure that you have enough available nitrogen. Excessive leaching or clear water irrigations will flush out and cause deficiencies. But again, don't go too high. Otherwise, you run into acidic problems. So a lot of people are targeting around 150 part per million. If you're top irrigating, 25% lower if you're using bottom irrigation. Keep in mind that substrates don't have a lot of nutrient holding capacity. So therefore, going to zero is usually not a good idea. You're going to run out of nutrients in that mix after about 2 to 3 weeks, and it's going to hold back the plant. If you need to give a boost, a single application of about 300 part per million will help get those rates up. So let's shift to another factor of trying to recognize the differences that occur when you have pH problems. So for the most part, the sweet zone is 5.4 to 6.4. If it gets out of that, it starts getting problematic. You should do something. And then when it gets the red zone, you definitely need to make changes. So for most crops, though, there is variation there of where to target between a 5.4 and a 6.4. The reason for that, when you look at this chart going from pH 4 to 8, and then you look at the width of the band, the wider it is, the nutrient is more readily available. And it's less readily available when it's thin. And so when the pH gets too high, the two problems, really the main problem we run into is iron uptake. It's tied up. Sometimes you can run into a boron problem, but iron's the main one. So you can see here the classic symptoms: intervenal chlorosis with that caladium in the green veins. That's like the poster child of what typical symptomology is. Got a euphorbia there, and also the upper growth you can see occurring on that poinsettia. Also here, when you look at deficiencies on intervenal chlorosis, initially on basal and then more advanced on the right with basal occurs. So more intensive yellowing, but still going for the most part with an intervenal effect on that plant. But keep in mind, you can see the symptomology of an iron problem because there's high pH, there's not enough iron, but also if the plant can't get the iron taken up, it can develop the deficiency. In the case here, especially when you see the plant is stunted, you know something's going on with the root system. So look at the root system. And in fact, the photo on the right with the plant on the right, you can see that the plant had no roots. So without good roots, you're not going to have good shoots, and you're certainly not going to get uptake of iron in that plant. Another classical case, here's one plant stunted in the middle of all of those. Is it Is it a nutrient problem? Probably not. It ought to be better on distribution. Is it a high pH problem? No, you ought to see more of them. With it being stunted, look at the root system, and you're probably going to find out that a plant like that has root rot and it's not able to pick up that iron, not that there's an iron deficiency that's going on. So if you think you have a problem, make sure you test the pH and then go through and see if low temp, wet growing, root rot is hindering iron uptake and it's not a pH or iron delivery problem with that plant. And we'll go over chelated iron applications if you need to make an application in a few minutes. So let's shift now to the bottom end that where more people are unfamiliar with the symptomology. So again, the same chart. And so in the case when the pH gets between 4 and 5, you have wider bands of iron and manganese. And those two are typically the problems that we most likely see. And it's more available, and therefore it can lead to toxic uptake of the plant and then symptomology. There's a number of different species that run into problems. They're listed there. Geraniums is a big one. Pentas has problems, marigold, those are probably the three biggest ones that you're going to see problems occurring. Gerbera will also. The other ones are a little more minor. We've highlighted some in some egro alerts, but those other plants can have symptomology due to low substrate pH. Now, what we've found is there are basically three different possibilities of symptomology. You get the bronzing, which is classical. You get the blackish purpley spots that are in the middle photo. And then the other one is you get stunting. And oftentimes it's said that a plant, oh, it's not sensitive to low pH. Well, what we really should be saying instead is it doesn't manifest high levels of iron or manganese to get toxic conditions on the foliage. And in the case here with this petunia, and then we'll have some other photos, what you saw and would see instead is you're going to see stunting of that plant. So let's go over each of these different symptoms in the plant. For the most part, when you're looking at symptomology, the upper foliage is iron deficiency due to the high pH, and the low pH symptomology is at the bottom half of the plant. It's a little tougher to find that out when you're looking at a rosette type of a plant, but you can clearly see the blackening of the leaf spots at the bottom of this plant. The poster child for this is iron toxicity on a marigold that you look at this, you actually probably would be initially thinking it's a magnesium deficiency. So you got to do a pH test. You can do a tissue test to confirm what's going on. You can see the severity going on from left to right. It goes to necrosis. It really, in the case of marigolds, is an iron accumulation, not really a manganese accumulation that's going on with the plant. Geraniums can oftentimes have a problem in the southeast because we have no alkalinity in the water. For many locations, we'll see pH drop occur. And so when you have the accumulation of toxic levels like this going on in the plant, you cannot get those toxic levels out. So you only can overcome this by getting the pH up and getting new growth on that plant. And so you do not turn around a toxic condition if it occurs. So you can see the symptomology increasing here that Josh Henry and I were on an extension trip and we collected samples, and you can see how the symptomology progresses here on a geranium. And so some other plants are a little more reddish, like the case here with Streptocarpus. We thought it was a phosphorus deficiency, but the tissue test and the pH was low to help confirm what was going on. You can see kind of the reddening going on here, the bronzing with the ageratum, and it was only a pH of 5.1 in which that occurred. So the other type is more of a blackening. I associate that more with higher manganese accumulation because of the historical description that if you steam a soil too high at a too high of a temperature, that manganese toxicity is described as a blackening. But if you do a tissue test, you still might have equal are higher iron in there. So it's not a direct correlation of what we see occurring in the plant. So it's an iron manganese toxicity, but I do look at this as being more of a manganese problem. You can see the severity of the progression, the symptomology, especially the one on the right with the little yellowing occurring in the plant. Here we have the same thing occurring on azenia. And then the third type of stunting, and again, these are for plants that might not necessarily exhibit symptomology because they're not accumulating excessive levels of iron manganese. Here's the case of stunting on a petunia. Now, we've seen on some other species of petunia, we will get some bronzing occurring. But in this case, the plants were 59% smaller when grown at pH 3.3 compared to 5.1. And we also saw stunting occurring on poinsettias. You can see the plants are smaller there. So again, the two types of symptomology that we mostly see when it manifests itself is due to iron, is the bronzing, and more so to manganese being the blackish purpling coloration. And here is a little more of a highlight of that symptomology. And then again, here's some stunting that occurred growing the plant on the left, the cannabis at 3, it's smaller compared to growing at pH 6. And part of the reason is that, again, good roots make good shoots. At pH 3, you can see that the root system is not well developed in that plant. And so therefore, you're going to limit uptake of nutrients and help on plant growth. So if you think the pH is too low, basically you got to start with a tissue test and a pH test. The pH test you can do in-house. See if the pH is below 5.5. Below 5, you pretty well know where the problems come in. I always use 5.0 as the, kind of like the target of knowing exactly you're going to have problems occurring with that plant, but it's not always the case. It can be a little higher on that plant. And flowable lime or hydrated lime are the corrective procedures that can be done. So if you monitor the pH and EC, kind of like with the pour-through method, 1 to 2 or SME, you can prevent a lot of those problems from occurring because you're going to know that it's starting to drift and you make a change along the way. And so we do have resources that are available online. FertDirtAndSquirt.com. AFE was a sponsor of that has fact sheets for a lot of crops. And it also has the corrective procedures that you can use for correcting high and low pH and EC in most situations that you might run into. We've done that at NC State in conjunction with Garrett Owen, who's at The Ohio State University. So the third part that I want to talk about is largely based on some prior work that Josh Henry did during his master's degree. Josh is now with Ball as one of the technical people. And so he did phosphorus deficiency work back starting in 2015, so 10 years ago. So when you look at phosphorus deficiency, it's also the case that it's a mobile element. So we always say that it's in the lower foliage because it's mobile. And so what you see here is the side view and the top view of some marigolds. You can see the plant smaller when things start uh, uh, being limited due to limited phosphorus to the plant. We're inducing this in our system, and so we're withholding phosphorus. You can also see on the photo on the right, the comment that is made that plants are darker green in color with a phosphorus deficiency. So it's probably going to be due that as the leaf expands, chlorophyll is distributed out. So it's lighter in green. And when the leaf is smaller, the chlorophyll is packed closer together. And so you have a higher chlorophyll concentration per unit area that gives you the darker green coloration of that plant. But then as things progress, and it doesn't take long to start seeing the necrosis coming, and then it gets more severe as you can look at the advanced stages on the right. And then at the end of the cycle, you get flowering on the plant, but the plant is spindly and the growth is stunted. So you can see in the case here with the marigold with problems with phosphorus. Now, what we typically see and describe as a phosphorus deficiency is lower leaf purpling. And so you can get that with low P if the temps are too low and the plant can't take up phosphorus, or there's root rot. Kind of similar situations that we run into in iron. If the plant can't get it, you can see the symptomology occurring in that plant. But the other symptomology that's not quite as well recognized is the, I say it's the development of this olive green leaf spots at the bottom foliage. But what really is happening is the leaf starts turning yellow and the leaf spots, the blotches remain on that plant. So a classical case with Calibrachoa, you see it on petunia, you see it on poinsettia, that if you've gone too low of restricting phosphorus, say to control growth, you can get into deficient conditions. You probably should not go under 5 part per million. And so phosphorus is an essential element for plant growth. And if you cross that line, you can start seeing the symptomology and then necrosis occurring on that plant. The other aspect that Josh Henry looked at, and we ran into this with a grower, then trying to confirm it, and that is if phosphorus is low, and because it's mobile, that when it's translocated from the old foliage up to the fruit, so fruit and flowers are primary sinks. That's where the plant wants to reproduce. It goes up there. But the leaves below those fruits are going to be low too, and they get bypassed. And so you see the development of symptomology in the upper foliage. And that is not very well understood or being able to recognize, because I wasn't able to recognize this symptomology when it occurred with a grower. Hence, we started doing the research project to confirm what's happening with the plant. So phosphorus will be in higher demand or moved in preference to the reproductive tissues like a pepper or a flower, and you'll see the symptomology if you have marginally low phosphorus in the plant. Because a lot of phosphorus gets uptaken the first half of the cycle of the plant and then is moved around as needed with future growth. You can also see here with cannabis that you have smaller plant size if you are controlling growth, but we're also then going into necrosis with that plant. Another thing to keep in mind that with more of a bronze or red type plant, like the case here of fennel, that when you start getting deficiency symptoms, you might mistakenly think that orangey color is more of a phosphorus problem, but in the case here, it is a nitrogen deficiency. So there's a mimic there that you need to just be aware of when you're trying to do the diagnosis. So if you do think that you have low phosphorus, you just need to add more. The sweet spot is probably 8 to 15 part per million will give you maximum growth. You ought to go a little higher if it's a fruiting thing like an ornamental pepper. 15 to 20 would be your range. Above that, there's no reason to apply that much. The plant doesn't need it. Also keep in mind low temperatures, wet growing, root rot, all limit the uptake. No different than what was recommended for iron. And so, a single application of 20-10-20 at 200 part per million N will give you 42 part per million P. So it'll give you ample amount to ramp it back up, because you'll see if you go zero, you'll see a deficiency in 2 to 3 weeks in that plant. First, it will be stunted. You're okay with that, and then it can go south pretty badly after that point. So the final stage is just to try to share with you some of the things that are going on with us at the program at NC State University. And I wanted to share with you the project that we're doing in conjunction with the American Floral Endowment. And we also had some funding on some aspects earlier with the Fred C. Glockner Foundation. And we are trying to redefine or get better interpretation ranges for leaf tissue values. We are tapping into old data that we have. We're tapping into our nutrient deficiency system. But, I do a lot of diagnostics for growers. without having adequate data, we've run into problems of just guessing. We have usually only a sufficiency range based on a survey, a very narrow range, but we need it better defined and we need to know where the problems are with those samples. And that's what we're doing in this project. This is headed up by 3 grad students. The initial work was Patrick Veazey. Luke Finn's currently working on it with the AFE grant. And then we also added this aspect on to Danielle Clade's MS degree. She finished in May of looking at this for some herb species along with our CEA project that we're doing with Michigan State. And so we can induce disorders in our system because we have a complete fertilizer minus an element. And then we love our logo or our motto. We kill plants so you don't have to. So we can get the symptomology to know this is nitrogen deficiency. This is phosphorus deficiency in our system. So we've been doing this for a number of years with a number of students. So I showed this photo earlier. So we want the leaf tissue here to help define the standard of where what levels are too low and also too high. Too high is not actually well defined in the literature because most people know it goes up and then they go out and they don't follow it through all the way to the end. Um, while we have 8 rates here, we added some higher ones also to get that upper limit. So we're running 10 rates right now to get the data that we're looking on for the curves. So how do we use that data? And so basically we're looking at distribution curves. Here's the case of petunia with nitrogen. And so there's 3 curves there, a red, a blue, and a green. They represent 3 models. There's the normal distribution, but sometimes data is skewed, so a gamma or a Weibull works best. Well, you can look at the bottom and it says that it's a gamma. So gamma was better. So the green zone represents the middle 50% of the samples. And in this case, that is identifying 4.42 to 5.99 as being sufficient. And then there's 25% left on both ends. So of that last 25% at the bottom, the last 2.5% is denoted as being deficient. Otherwise, it's being low. And then correspondingly at the top 25%, the last 2.5 is represented as being excessive. So we got the quartiles that we can then get values that correspond to a plant being grown at deficient, low, sufficient, high, and excessive. And then if we need to do a diagnostic, we have better values than a very narrow range. And so the values are lining up very well with some of the previous nutrient deficiency samples. We're saying with the model below 3.2%, you're deficient. And in fact, with running some of the samples through with Gibson, as a grad student, we were at 205. So we're well within the deficient range on that. And then you look at the green box, that was the survey range that Bryson and Mills, that is the Bible of plant nutrition values that we have, but it's kind of a survey. And so we have been able to dial it back on the values and, make it a little higher, make it a little lower for what is sufficient. And then the other values would fall into being low or high with those samples. So it will better enable us to diagnose problems for what's going on. We've run it for petunias. We've run it for gerbera as part of the Glockner grant. We've run it for 5 herbs. Currently, Luke Finn is working on it with poinsettias, then the spring gerbera and New Guineas as part of the AFE grant. And so we're also trying to collect data from other crops to look at curves. So hopefully we'll have improved curves for at least 10, if not 20 different species over the next few years. So that will improve the ability to make a diagnosis if problems are occurring for each of the elements that we're looking at. And so this is the mega table that would come out of that. So this is for petunias, looking at the ranges of sufficient, low and deficient going down, high and excessive going up for each of the elements in question. So it will be an improvement of being able to diagnose problems in plants. So finally, I want to talk about some of the grower resources that we have available that might help you grow the spring crop, because our goal is to create some very photo-rich guides to help you in the diagnostic process. Of course, there's the eGrow Alert. American Floral Endowment is one of the sponsors, e-grow.org to sign up for the alerts. And it goes over problem solving of different things that are going on for plants. So it's free. Consider signing up for it. You'll have it in the future. I've also talked already about Fert, Dirt, and Squirt with the nutritional guides that are there. Again, AFE was a sponsor of that. And so that information will help you target better fertility on the crops that you're growing. We've also shifted into doing more diagnostic guides, more print on demand at lulu.com. If you go through and then search by my last name, Whipker, it's the easiest way to get them all up. We've done, I think, 7 in the last year, nutritional monitoring, a virus, and then crop cultural guides for 5. We're hoping to get another few done by the end of the year. So that's kind of tapping into the data that we have prior publication in our photo library to bring together grower resources on a print-on-demand book. So it's something to consider if you need that for your operation. So with doing anything, you got to think who helps us get it done. And so, of course, AFE and Glockner have been big supporters with different research grants. And then a number of different companies have supported our research over the last few years, including very useful of doing the CEA herb grant with Michigan State University. So we thank them for their support. And uh, so with that, getting towards the end, just want to put a shout out for the next one that's coming up on Tuesday, December 9th. Michelle Jones from the Ohio State University is going to present the next webinar. So put that on your radar. And so with that, I will open it up for questions, and I thank you for watching.
Brian, thank you for your presentation. I'd like to open up the session now for Q&A. We do have some in the chat, so I'll start there. The question states, I have Confederate jasmine that has started to get white leaves starting in the veins. I added an iron supplement, but I am not sure that was the remedy. Any advice?
When I haven't grown the crop, so experience is really good of diagnosing. But when you look at white veins, the two main things that come to mind, if it's nutritional, but it doesn't happen very often. Manganese deficiency, when you look at it, does give you a white vein. Iron deficiency, it's interveinal. The veins are green, the rest are yellow. So it's probably not an iron problem, but maybe trying more of an overall micro mix might help. Um, the other thing that I often look at that when you get veination problems like that occurring is to go back and see whether or not you've applied any drenches, because you can get that uptake to the plant and you get more of a vein damage on some chemicals that would go on. So those are the two things that come to mind as possibilities.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Another question is it difficult to accumulate too much phosphorus?
I saw that question in the chat while it was the seminar was going on, and I guess is it too? I'm not quite understanding the question, so I'm gonna try to hopefully answer it. So, can you have excessive phosphorus applied? The answer is yes. Usually, you're going to go north of 80 to 120 part per million that you can start seeing detrimental effects with plants. But Josh Henry's work went up to, I think, 120 part per million on petunias, and we did not see a negative effect. But you wasted a lot of money on phosphorus along the way. Um, so it has been reported to be too high for normal crops that you just have to watch for. Um, you can get some necrosis. We did that on some poinsettias, one of the first studies as a grad student. But if you're looking at the crops that are considered Australian natives, they evolved in soils that were naturally deficient in phosphorus. And so consequently, they are very sensitive to excessive phosphorus in the soil. But what occurs is not a toxic uptake of phosphorus. It's an antagonism that limits iron uptake. So many times with scavola, an iron deficiency, if the pH checks out and you're adding iron, it might be that you're adding too much phosphorus. So you usually it's probably good to target under 10 part per million phosphorus to something like a scavola or some of the other Australian natives.
Great, thank you. Are you doing any work on nutrient requirements and tissue ranges for Lysianthus? And if so, is there anything you can share about this?
We have not um, we haven't formally done the crop through there, even though I really like it. My colleague John Dole, before he became department head, was running some Lysianthus plants through the system for cuts, and there was extra plants, so we put them in a deficiency system. So I have some values, so you can email me because, for instance, a few years ago when Garrett Owen was up at Michigan State, he had a grower with cuts that had a problem. So we dealt one on one, but we didn't do every element and we didn't do it as a replicated study. So, but having said that, it's the only stuff that's out there. So something, when you got a problem, something's better than nothing. That's trying to get an answer there. So Brian or bwhipker@ncsu.edu would be the best way to send an email to ask and maybe more details of what you're looking for on that for that Lysianthus tissue. And that was done. Some of them might have been in bloom versus being all vegetative growth.
We have a question asking, what should we do for a copper deficiency?
Um, Copper deficiencies don't occur very often. Um, Apply a copper-based fungicide; it's your best bet. Usually, we run into not toxic, but very high levels, especially if people sprayed a copper fungicide and then didn't wash the tissue and submitted it. So a fungicide would work, or just um, like a Bordeaux mixture. Uh, Otherwise, just do a little higher micro mix. You'd have to convince me that through a tissue analysis that you actually had a copper problem. For our system, copper and molybdenum are really, really difficult to get. It does not come in very often. It comes in on teak, I can tell you that, but I don't know. For most other crops, we never got it on poinsettias, for instance. We could not get it induced. So tissue test to confirm, and then like a chelated copper. If you need something, I know some of these micros you can get like from ICL or JR Peters. Peters even does salts, but they also both of them have most or stem that you can add to the mix. That's probably an overall better one to work for.
Is sulfur deficiency similar to iron deficiency on Calibrachoa?
Um, I would I would say no. So I'm trying to think out my answer. It's not that I have an answer. It's just like how am I going to formulate it? When you look at sulfur deficiency, sulfur is partially mobile. That means it comes kind of where the mature leaves are at, but not the lower and not the upper. Iron is upper, nitrogen is lower, sulfur's in between. Now, over time, sulfur will go on up to the top foliage. It is like nitrogen, it usually starts on a complete yellowing of the leaves, like nitrogen, not whereas iron on the top is an intervanal effect. Now, iron at advance will go totally yellow than white. So, we're talking at the beginning stages. Um, we did see a sample this fall on poinsettias that um, the only element that came up that was possibly low was sulfur. Um, but it was intervanal like iron. So I'm backtracking on you on the answer is a little bit, but in classic cases, it's a complete yellowing and works its way up. It's a dull yellowing that goes on. Um, I mean, we with our system, we've killed plants, about 50 different species with sulfur, so we kind of know what's going on. We haven't got copper that way, but sulfur is pretty classic conditions that occur. The only you and just most of the times when I see a sulfur deficiency, especially with a poinsettia crop, is they're using a CalMag fertilizer. And a CalMag fertilizer, because of mixing together, calcium doesn't play well. And so it cannot go with the sulfate because otherwise it forms a uh, precipitate to the bottom. It's wallboard. Um, and so they use magnesium nitrate to get the CalMag. That means you don't have any sulfur. And so we have run into sulfur deficiency occurring on some poinsettia crops sporadically. There's at least one, if not two, eGrow alerts that address that. If it's early symptomology, you can make the application and the new growth will turn around. If it's too far gone, you still have a pale yellow on the ones that are severely affected, and you don't get the new growth to turn around, is what we found.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Another question is, what diagnostic indicators help distinguish chemical spray phytotoxicity from nutrient toxicity slash deficiency symptoms in our greenhouse environment?
Ooh, that's a multi-prong approach. Okay. Usually most micros, when there's toxicity, is going to burn the lower foliage. Most macro elements, when that's a toxicity, will cause an antagonism to the other elements. So excess of potassium is usually a magnesium or calcium deficiency. Excess of calcium really doesn't play well with magnesium. Usually magnesium's the loser in that three-way interaction. So that's what happens on that. So like excess phosphorus, you're going to get an iron deficiency. And so for going on. So deficiencies, no, the mobility, is it lower foliage that gives you the, NPK is the big one, magnesium, phosphorus. Um, uh, Upper foliage, it's usually iron, maybe boron going on, but a lot in environmental boron. And then there's calcium. That's usually an environmental issue in most cases, except for brackage burn. Then when you start going into sprays, it's a little more difficult. Many times with working with the diagnostic clinic at NC State University, we that sometimes turns out to be the default answer from the standpoint that nothing else checks out. Um, it is hard to definitively confirm a physiological disorder or spray burn phytotoxicity unless you know on your spray records of what went on. There are some chemicals like the insect growth regulators, when applied to some crops. For instance, judo will tear the holy Toledo out of lobularia. But you know what? It happens 2 weeks later. So it really was hard to diagnose that problem. But it happened in my greenhouse, so that helped. So there's the lake parrot, adapt. I think it was adept on poinsettias. That came 4 weeks later. Looked like a calcium deficiency. So if it's a spray that you made, try to look for if a leaf's covering it up and that there's no damage where it was covered. That kind of helps. Also know that spray damage is probably going to come in about 3 days if it's just a chemical phyto that occurred. And a lot of times I'll look at a sample and then look at the new growth. If it's nutritional, usually it continues unless it's a toxicity. But if it's a spray damage, it happened once, the new growth is then fine. So I target in on the new foliage. I look at what's covered to help me define that I'm pointing this direction versus that, and then look at the spray records. It's kind of let's call it an art versus educated guesstimation that goes on. And so, I usually give growers with clinic probabilities, and one of them is that I don't know. And I don't like saying that because you're trying to figure out a problem, but it plants plants don't tell you what's going on. They don't give you any clues. So it's sometimes hard. And I have the record is 5 years after a problem that I finally went back to the grower when I figured it out. So, um, I, so anyway, okay. Hopefully that answered enough. It's an art.
Okay, another question is, we are coming back from some extreme sodium buildup and are in a better place now, but have a lot of residual yellow growth. Is there anything you'd recommend to help green plants up?
Sodium. Um, you, you know, sodium is like it doesn't play well with antagonisms of potassium, calcium, and magnesium. I've actually seen sodium cause uh, potassium deficiency in an organic production system because potassium is the hardest element to get in the system. So I would probably recommend trying to make sure that you got a complete K, calcium, magnesium feed to the plant so that you're overcoming if there's an antagonism there. But probably before that, if the standard procedure is to try to leach out the excess sodium if possible, depending on your production system of why it accumulated, and then adding that nutrients in to try to counterbalance it and get things going back with the plant. Um, Probably sodium above about 100 part per million starts getting detrimental. Chloride, it might be 70. Chloride's about 70 to 100 too. Those are the two that you need to be concerned with.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, what would be a safe level of free chlorine and chloride when applied together with a fertilizer for sanitation?
I don't know that answer.
Okay.
Uh, call Paul Fisher.
There you go. Call Paul
So
Fisher.
I can look up his cell phone number. No, no, I can't do that.
Okay. Another question is, we are located in South Texas with high alkalinity irrigation water, and our main crops are petunias and calibrachoa. If our 2-to-1 substrate EC and pHs are in range, could pH of the initial irrigation be causing issues as well?
Okay, so the test confirms that it's okay, even though you have high water, pH and alkalinity. Um, it, it, uh, it should check out. I guess I'm not quite following the question that if things are going good in the way end, you probably need to go with a lower, maybe not even have a pre-plant charge. Um, and then with that alkalinity, trying to neutralize it probably with sulfuric acid if it's really that high. But you could lower the amount of lime in the mix. So you start with a lower pH so that your drift up isn't quite as quick, would be a possibility. You're just going to have to monitor it because some of those that poor water conditions are challenging, looking at accumulation and then burn. So shorter term crops would be ideal. And if you could use some rainwater to help dilute that would be wonderful. Again, water quality work with Paul Fisher. If it's really that severe, you might have to look at RO systems, and then you can blend it back along with if you can get any rainwater, depending on your location, if you can get that done.
Okay, well, thank you. Another question from the chat is, has any work been done to refine our leaf tissue interpretation guidelines of perennial crops?
No. But for refining them, no. Your main resource that you're going to have is that Bryson and Mills plant analysis 4 handbook. That is the Bible. They have a number of crops that are in there that are, again, it's survey They went out and the plant looks good. We took a number of samples, we ran it, and then this is normal, happy plant, but whether or not it was too far to the side, but the plant looked good. It doesn't help us when we get to the wings. But that is unfortunately all we have. Um, I'm I'm hoping time will allow Garrett Owen, if he has interest, to do that because with his new position at the Ohio State University, he does both floriculture and he does nursery. And there is a nice there is a need for that to be done. Um, uh, you don't need that data until you have a problem. And then when you have a problem, you really need it. And that's the challenge. So it's um, I mean, for us, what we're doing, we're tapping into some data sets from NCDA, our state lab, partnering with them. And so we need about 500 tissue samples to really be starting to get in the golden zone. Um, and how we build it, we get the rate, then we find the top and the bottom with that rate study and deficiencies, and then we build the bulk of the curve with grower samples to look at the distribution. That's a simple way of looking at it. We can put in other experiments, but to amass that many samples is actually problematic. And luckily, we did plant nutrition work. We did a lot of tissue. We could get some samples from them. We had access to that database that we're mining, but that knowledge is not there hardly at all in perennials. And so it would be building from the ground up. So it's going to be challenging. But Garrett's done like hooker rates that he's published scientifically and a few other species. So there's the possibility that he's going to build on that. But just like floriculture, I say there's 1,000 nursery crops, there's 1,000 floriculture crops. And then perennials go kind of somewhere in between. And so there's endless possibilities. It just money and time.
Well, thank you. So we are almost out of time, so I just want to say that any unanswered questions will be answered in a separate email. And I wanted to thank you for joining us today for another session of AFE's Grow Pro webinar series. Join us next month for Dr. Michelle Jones's presentation on biostimulants for floriculture production on Tuesday, December 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Register ahead at endowment.org/growpro. While there, check out our past webinar recordings, other grower-related resources, and research reports available to you free thanks to industry support. If you have found these webinars valuable, we encourage you to make a donation to AFE to support future research. If you make a contribution by December 31st, your donation will qualify for a special gift match 2-to-1, tripling your impact. The link will be in the chat if you would like to make a contribution. We also ask that you please complete the brief survey about today's session where you can suggest additional topics and help us continue to improve these webinars. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you have a great day.